So, gentlemen, let's go further. There probably won't be much paranormal sounding stuff in this one, since the real question here is not how somebody would do this, but why the fuck somebody would do this. Let's go. It happened in '91, which was a hard time. Levels of apathy and general unprofessionalism in Russia were off the charts back then, which played a role in this case. No one was sure about tomorrow and the future of their country. It all began with a call from a very bad address for a shitty reason. The apartment complex where it all happened can be seen on the photo that I'll add to this post. For as long as I can remember, this particular place was always considered bad and dangerous. But not because it had ghosts or some shit like that, of course. Reason was much simpler. It was a former dorm that, in those times, was filled with people from the very bottom of society. Robberies, knifings, and murders happened there regularly. Even I had a chance to see the local, so to say, customs personally when I was a kid. I was riding my bicycle nearby when a human head flew out of some window and landed about 30 meters away from me. According to rumors, some drug addicts had an argument. But anyway, I'm just telling you this so that you would better understand the kind of atmosphere this place had and why I didn't go inside to take some photos for you. Yes, I pissed myself. Getting back on the topic, in one of the flats on the second floor, a family was murdered. Said family consisted of a single mother, her 7-year-old daughter, and, as was found out later, a year-old infant. They were extremely poor and, according to the old lady living in the next apartment, poor thing was nearly driven to a heart attack when she discovered the bodies, the mother held no job, drank non-stop, and often brought some suspicious men home. Daughter was practically homeless and never went to any sort of kindergarten or school. How the infant managed to survive in such a family is unclear. According to my grandpa, you should divide anything those old Soviet grannies say by 2 if you want to get closer to the truth, but it all looked shitty nonetheless. The door was slightly ajar, which allowed for bodies to be found. As far as the bodies, at first glance, it looked like a typical case of domestic violence. With some excessive force, though. Around 30 knife wounds on each body. Criminology experts' theory was that those wounds were inflicted on the already dead bodies. The mother was killed in the kitchen. Signs of a struggle were all around. Furniture was overturned, fridge handle torn off, and some dishes broken. A bottle of uncharacteristically expensive vodka and some rotting delicacies were picturesquely lying on a cheap, dilapidated table. Daughter, it looked, was killed in her sleep because she was found in her bed in a fetal position. No signs of resistance. As for the infant, no trace of him was found, except for a baby's fence in the sister's room. The infant's very existence was only corroborated by that same old lady, and later other neighbors. No diapers, no baby food, no stroller, and no birth certificate. Nothing. Which is, considering the social status of the family, very possible. But even a surface-level search of the apartment revealed a lot of interesting things. Not only that the freezer was chock full of expensive food and alcohol, but there was also a very large sum of money hidden in the icebox. Literally a few packs of money hidden inside the cheap wrappings, which was a normal way to hide money and valuables from possible robbers in those days. But what were they doing in the apartment of these piss-poor people? That raised some questions, because the connection between those valuables and deaths was obvious. Further questionings of the neighbors and the local alcoholics in the yard clarified 3 important things. First of all, murdered woman was popular here, if you know what I mean, and her door was usually open. Second, according to a score of witnesses, a strange man started to visit her in the last week. He clearly wasn't local, and even though descriptions slightly varied from witness to witness, they painted a certain picture. Uncertain age, completely bald head, always in the same brown 3-piece suit, patent leather shoes, and a bow tie. In short, he looked like he was loaded with some dough. No one could provide investigators with any distinctive details of his physical appearance or face. Such people rarely, if ever, visited this place, and it is, as a whole, a separate question as to why didn't anyone try to rob or beat him up, because those kinds of people are not too popular in that house, to say the absolute bloody least. Many people saw him entering the apartment complex and the victim's flat, but no one saw him leave. Another thing was the suspect's interesting and unusual manner of speech. According to people who talked to him, it was florid, artsy, and old-fashioned, and extremely polite. Sadly, no one could quite recall what the man asked about, though all witnesses could recall was that he had some questions. Which wasn't particularly unusual in such a place, since inhabitants were unusually drunk or on something. He was seen at least 3 times in the last week, though by the time the militia arrived he hadn't been seen there for 3 days straight. And, finally, the third important piece of info. The moment this man started to come to the apartment complex, the victim stopped receiving visitors, and her flat, for the first time in years, fell silent. No shouts, no loud noises, and no baby cries. So, yes, the infant's existence was finally corroborated by the accounts of most witnesses, but no one remembered the dead woman ever being pregnant. Bodies then were brought to a coroner. When they were loading them into the car, it looked as though every bone in their bodies was broken, basically behaved like a couple of rag dolls. Further search of the apartment didn't provide investigators with any additional details. No signs of forced entry, no traces of blood except for those on the victims. The bottle of vodka and glasses on the table were, of course, checked for fingerprints, but only the prints that belonged to the victim were found. Doorknobs in her flat gave such a wild range of different fingerprints that experts exhausted themselves to no end just by comparing every set with what they had in their databases. In any case, almost all the fingerprints belonged to the local lowlifes who hadn't seen her for at least 2 weeks. Now, the coroner's report was much more fucking interesting. Indeed, the injuries on the bodies were inflicted when the victims were already dead for around a day at that point. But this is not the interesting thing. The autopsy showed that every bone in their bodies, except for the skull and cervical vertebrae, became extremely brittle and were, basically, heavily damaged by who the fuck knows what. They certainly weren't broken by the blunt force trauma, since there was no traces of such damage on the bodies themselves, not to mention that it would be a very tiring process, breaking every tiny bone in a human body. Also, bodies would look like a couple of torn bloody bags after that. The damage dealt to the bones reminded the local militia expert of the effects of highly concentrated hydrofluoric acid, but there was 2 big problems with this theory. First, hydrofluoric acid of such concentration would have left extreme chemical burns. Considering that all of the mother's and daughter's bones were heavily damaged, they would have to take a bath in the acid to achieve such an effect. But there were no surface traces of that. Second, this acid leaves such a chemical bouquet in the human body that tests would have certainly identified it. But the only irregular thing about the bones was the critical lack of calcium, and that was that. At the same time that the tests were being conducted, a call came from one of the witnesses that was interrogated earlier. He saw the suspect entering the boiler house near the apartment complex. Not wasting any time, my grandfather got 2 operatives and moved out. Door to that boiler house territory was indeed open. Whether it was lockpicked by the suspect or just left unclosed by the sloppy workers was never found out, but according to all regulations, the door must have been locked. In the photos, you can see that very boiler house. Kindly forgive me for not trying to get inside. There was an actual lock hanging there now, and trying to climb over the concrete walls with barbed wire is not my idea of fun. So, Grandpa went there and met 2 middle-aged women working inside. By the way, there was supposed to be 5 or 6 personnel working there at all times, according to regulations. This is probably the reason why something blew up inside when I was a kid. They were noticeably twitchy and were not acting normal, as if afraid. When questioned about the suspect, they nervously laughed and denied any knowledge about him. The way they tried to bullshit me was pretty cartoonish, according to my grandpa. But at that point, my gramps didn't give much of a fuck about them. Just left one of his operatives there to watch the main entrance and those 2. The other one of his subordinates he took with him to more effectively conduct the search of the area. By the way, the building was pretty fucked up. It, as you can see from the photos, is very old and multi-tiered. So everywhere there was moisture, rust, and only 1 out of every 10 light bulbs was working, so they had to get the flashlights. In the far corner of that building, one that probably no one visited for years, a baby's loose jacket was found, hanging between the interweaving pipes. Grandpa and his subordinates started to frantically search everywhere in the area. They literally looked under every single pipe in that building, but found nothing. Even the criminology expert who arrived later had no luck with fingerprints or any prints whatsoever. The baby's jacket had no traces of blood on it, or any other traces at all. It looked so clean as if it was just recently washed. The 2 women were called later for questioning. One of them kept stating that she saw or knew nothing, and the other disappeared after the very first interrogation. As her melancholic drunkard of a husband said later, she just left home without even packing any of her belongings. Despite all the numerous questions the militia asked her husband and colleague, despite checking all possible connections, nothing gave any result. For all intents and purposes, those women were completely normal. Even their fingerprints were taken in compared to those in the victim's flat, but this naturally ended with failure. At that point, the case came to a grinding halt and it seemed that there was nowhere left to dig. Suddenly, a month later, another call came from the same apartment complex, from the same old lady who found the bodies. According to her, faint sounds of crying were coming from the now sealed apartment where the murders took place. Operative Investigatory Group answered the call. My gramps told me that he almost physically felt surrealism of the situation. Sealed door of the dead apartment had no signs of forced entry, and Gramps indeed heard a faint sound of a baby crying inside. It took them half an hour to get inside the apartment, and, indeed, an infant was found there. Only he had no eyes. I mean, there was no blood or anything, just no eyes. As was later found out, they were surgically removed from his eye sockets. A thin layer of pink skin was covering the places where the eyes should have been, with tiny scars marking them, as if after plastic surgery. No injuries or pathologies beyond that were found. If you are curious about his fate, he was first brought to a children's hospital, then to an orphanage for infants. I don't know what happened to him later, but I suggest he had a very unhappy life, though I'm curious if anything else strange happened to him. So it goes, gentlemen. I'm tired as fuck typing all this. Translator's note. Imagine what it's like typing and translating it, bitch. But I will add my grandpa's theory and a couple of my own thoughts nonetheless. His theory was that the infant was basically bought from his alcoholic mother by that guy in the three-piece suit. But something went wrong with the deal, which led to him killing the mother and the daughter as a witness. Method of murder itself was much less clear. Let's suppose the knife wounds were either a way to lead the investigation on the wrong path, though the murderer seemed too clever to think that they would fool the experts, considering that he clearly knew how not to leave any traces of his presence, or mask away the bone-damaging substance that entered the body. Though injuries on both bodies seemed very random. Some parts of the bodies were covered with injuries, while the others were left untouched. And, again, the experts had no idea what kind of poison could have such an effect without leaving any traces. Next thing, who would leave such a huge sum of money to a corpse? There really was a fuckload of money there, and only some poor woman who drank away her brains could think that no one would find them. But fact is fact, the money was there. How to tie it in with those two women from the boiler house, I have no fucking idea. By the way, the one that left and never came back, my grandpa often returned to this case and checked for any new information about her possible whereabouts. I guess someone managed to scare them pretty good, but there's no way to know now, really. And fuck if I know what the baby jacket was doing there. Next, the infant. Where did the victim get him? Was he stolen? Left on her doorstep? Scars from such things as eyeball removal don't heal in a mere month, as you might know. Was it some other baby? But how and why? Also, those who saw the child before all this happened stated that he had a birthmark on the right side of his forehead. Baby with no eyes had the exact same birthmark. I guess getting inside the sealed apartment wasn't much of a challenge, since the killer might have had the keys. But even without all that, I think there is many mysterious things about this story. That's it. You might fling some shit at me, because this case didn't have much in the terms of paranormal, but believe me, the next case has it in spades. Hello everyone, I just want to say thank you for listening. Make sure to like the video if you enjoyed this story, and remember to subscribe if you want to hear more in the future. Click the bell icon in order to be alerted when I have more stories to tell, and until then, don't steal your Russian grandfather's notebook.